Next thing I'd like to talk about with you is the income tax. This is interesting. I've met your father, and he's a highly principled guy, but I mean, he let them put him in jail for years because of.
Well, he's still there.
I know.
He's 80. He's 85 or 86. I forget now.
This is
exactly
shocking that they would put a guy that age in jail, not for any crime of any type, but just for standing up. What do you think about this? Tell me about Irwin and what this is all about.
Well, I regard my father as a political prisoner. I mean, that's
right.
You know, governments put people in prison if they represent a threat to the government. And I think the government perceives my father as a threat. In fact, I think he's categorized as a terrorist. But he's not terrorizing Americans. I think, you know, maybe he could strike fear into the government if they think that, hey, you know, if Schiff's ideas catch on, we're in trouble. But, you know, my father believes in liberty and the Constitution and the rule of law, and he doesn't believe that the government collects taxes legally. He thinks the government violates not only the codified law, not only the, you know, the Internal Revenue Code, but the Constitution, and he has several Supreme Court decisions that back him up. And so he was, you know, he challenged it, not because he wanted to, you know, enrich himself and just, you know, not pay taxes. I mean, he's very upfront. It's not like he was deceiving the government and hiding his income, or, you know, I don't pay taxes, and here's why, and here's, you know, my rationale. And so the worst thing you could say about my father is that he was mistaken. You can't say that he was dishonest in what he believed. I think a lot of what he says is true, but the problem is the courts, you know, the courts let the government get away with murder today. And look, the court said, and it was a 5-4 decision, but the Supreme Court said Obamacare is constitutional. Now what, there were 4 justices that said it was unconstitutional. Are those 4 justices wrong? Why were the other 5 right? You know, I thought it was unconstitutional. I still think it's unconstitutional. I don't care, you know, what, you know, these judges that were pressured by politics, because one of the guys changed his mind like at the last second just because of political pressure. So, you know, I think that, you know, my father's, a lot of what he says is true about the income tax. But certainly, even if you don't look at the legal aspects of it, you can look at the economic aspects of it, and it's been a very destructive tax. It continues to be a destructive tax. It's probably the most destructive tax that we have. We'd be much better off as a nation if we abolished it.
But it is, but you know, the point that you made is an excellent one, Peter. He actually is a political prisoner because he stood up against the principle of the income tax, and they put him in jail for a decade.
Yeah, and if you read the trial transcript, so we have an appeal going right now, but it's taking forever just to get the appeals. But the judge, basically in this case, was, you know, I believe he was instructed to orchestrate a conviction. They stacked the jury. They put a bunch of Social Security and welfare recipients on the jury, and they basically say, if you acquit this guy, you're not going to get your Social Security checks anymore because nobody will pay income taxes. They don't let my father put on a case. They wouldn't let him introduce any evidence. They wouldn't let him put witnesses on. They wouldn't let him, every time he wanted to do something, no, you can't call that witness, you can't call this, you can't do this. So he really wasn't able to defend himself. He didn't have a lawyer at the time, but you know, and he could barely hear, you know, because he didn't have his hearing aid, and so part of it, he got like a year for contempt because, you know, in addition to his like 12-year or 13-year sentence. But, you know, the government doesn't really even prove their case. They put in no evidence. In fact, you know, when my father puts, you know, there's a, you know, IRS agent on the stand, and my father would say, okay, here's my tax return that you said is false. What, you know, what's false about it? And the government would object, and the judge would, and so my father couldn't even ask the agents. Nobody testified what was false about my father's returns. All they said is he had income and he didn't pay his taxes, therefore he's guilty. You know, but they wouldn't let him examine anybody. They wouldn't let him. There were people that, you know, lawyers or judges or people that, you know, believed him. He couldn't call them as witnesses. No. I mean, the whole thing. If you ever hear of this, you know, a banana court or kangaroo court you know, star chamber. That's what it really was. It was just an orchestrated conviction. It was the pretense of a fair trial. And then meanwhile, he gets 13 years in jail, You know, it's a nonviolent crime. It's that, you know,
No, it's completely shocking. It's all a political show trial. I mean, it would be embarrassing to the Stalinists. It's shocking.
Yeah, and even, you know, the government hired a psychiatrist to examine my dad, and basically the psychiatrist said that my father, you know, was so rigid in his beliefs that he was like, you know, that no matter, he was going to believe what he believed no matter what. You know, like my father was very sincere in his beliefs. The government hired this psychiatrist, and then my father wanted to call the psychiatrist to testify, and they wouldn't let him. And they wouldn't let him introduce any of his findings, because the psychiatrist would have been a good witness for my father, because he would have showed that my father believed what he said. According to the psychiatrist, my father was very genuine in his beliefs. The psychiatrist the government hired.
Yeah.
And then my father wants to call him as a witness, and they won't let him.
Well, they don't want to talk about philosophical principles and actual beliefs. Now, one more question, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, unfortunately. So
one more thing I want to tell you about my father, too. This is interesting. You know, because so they said that my father committed fraud, and he told people how not to pay taxes. So my father wanted to introduce as evidence his books, his videotape seminars, and they wouldn't let him. So he's trying. They're saying, "Here's what you did that was fraudulent. Okay, let's show the jury the things that I said." Oh no, they can't see that. They can't. So the government. Normally, you would think that the government would want to put that in as evidence to show. Look at the things that Irwin Schiff did. My father wanted to get all that stuff in, and the government objected, and the court didn't let it in.
Peter, it's impossible to have any respect for the whole system at this point.
You can go, if you go to his website, you know, paynoincometax.com, I think you can actually read. There's a lot of stuff from his trial transcript. You could read a lot of this stuff. It's up on the internet.